standard. Let's talk to Simeon Yates about this. Simeon's Professor of Digital Culture at the University of Liverpool, Joint Director of the Digital Media and Society Institute, and lead researcher for this study. Good evening, Simeon.
Good evening.
So tell us what this report says then.
So this report points out that a large proportion, nearly 50%, 45% of households with children, we focus on households with children, lack either the equipment or some of the key skills that you need to have a kind of basic digital life today. We don't mean they don't connect at all, but they're missing some of the key components that others might take for granted. Therefore, maybe their children don't have enough equipment to engage in education, or they don't have enough equipment and skills to engage with, say, digital services from the NHS and so on, or access benefits. So we found that there's quite a large proportion of households, though sadly that kind of didn't surprise us, given the levels of poverty in households with children and the levels of digital skills we know are in the UK workforce from other studies that we've been part of over the years.
Well, you say you're not surprised. I must admit that I am, myself. Getting on for half of UK families with children do not meet this sort of minimum digital living standard. So give us an idea of, I mean, you mentioned that it might be either or, a combination of a lack of ability to get online or a lack of equipment. So what did you mostly come across?
So we find about 80% of households have got the equipment they need, and we need to be clear that this standard wasn't set by us, that the important part of this project was not to do what we say research has done before and what the government and others have done before, is kind of decide what people need and then measure that. We actually did multiple rounds of discussion groups with households with children, with young people themselves, over 4 iterations feeding back into the discussion for them to agree this minimum. And it is a real minimum. We're talking things like an absolutely basic laptop for parents and first child, and then absolutely basic laptop or tablet if you've got more children. Absolutely basic mobile phone and so on. And some of the skills we're looking at here are really basic ones about being able to check that friend requests are okay, or being able to check that websites are secure when you're doing online shopping and so on. So really quite basic skills that the families decided were a minimum a household needed. Then we did a big national survey, and we find that a lot of households fall down on 1 or 2 of these measures. And again, like I said, sadly, for those of us who've been researching this for the last 20, 30 years, and as COVID really shone a light on, you know, when kids couldn't get access to education, the number of people in that circumstance is a lot larger than you might expect.
Yeah, people might be surprised that children lack the skills to get online. I mean, it might not be such a surprise that they lack the kind of hardware that you've been talking about, laptops and smartphones and so on, but they surely know how to use them, don't they?
Well, I think that's one of the big myths is the kind of digital native, that lots of people have grown up digital, so they know everything. What we actually find is that they can be very skilled at some parts of things, but not at others. I mean, I've told the story many times when we've done some similar work for the MOD, looking at skill sets in their workforce. Like, say, they get young men in who can Facebook like mad, but they struggle with other more complicated technologies. So I think we have a tendency to think just because someone's really clever on Facebook, well, young people won't use Facebook these days, you know, on TikTok or whatever, that they therefore also know how to use a laptop and do a little Excel file for their schoolwork. They're not the same set of skills. So we're not saying people have no skills, and we're not saying people have no access, but if you make a kind of minimum of kits, skills, services, then we find an awful lot of people, including young people, are missing some of that set.
So what then are the main consequences of being below this minimum digital living standard?
Well, I mean, the obvious one to point out is that there are an awful lot of households where there isn't really enough equipment to go around for all children to be able to get on with their education, so that impacts children's education. Similarly, if you've got low digital skills and a lack of equipment, lots of other things have gone online, from healthcare to accessing benefits to doing things like, online shopping. If you can't do online shopping, you can't get cheap deals, suddenly you're at a disadvantage to other families. I think the point we like to make is that digital exclusion or digital inequalities like this, they're not necessarily set on their own. If you have a lack of equipment and your child therefore doesn't get the opportunities at school they need, it amplifies existing educational barriers and inequalities, so it makes life harder. And as you said at the start, as more and more things go online, more and more things become harder to do if you don't have a full set of skills. A colleague of ours called Kat Dixon did a lovely kind of graphic where she plotted all of the things that have now become kind of digital first as little boxes in types, under healthcare and under entertainment and under engaging with your friends. So
deprivation and disadvantage.
I mean, that is one way of describing it, yes. We haven't had a digital inclusion strategy since 2014. There has been a recent House of Lords report, cross-party House of Lords report on this that we and others contributed evidence to, that's been quite damning about the lack of a kind of coordinated national UK response. So I would put our hands up to say the Welsh Government got very involved with this project because they want a minimum digital living standard for Wales to help drive their policy. The Scottish Government has been very involved in this area for a long time. But some of the regional governments, like Greater Manchester, Liverpool, and some of the other regional governments have kind of filled in the gap because there isn't a national framework, and have started to try and do things for specific groups. In Greater Manchester, a big project around social housing. They've been looking at people leaving care, people with long-term health issues and disability, trying to think of ways in which they can support them to be more digitally included, get the skills or get the equipment. And obviously big charities like you mentioned, the Good Things Foundation, they've got a national data bank where people can get SIM cards with data on them if they're disconnected.
It sounds as though it's something that would be holding the country back.
Well, that's what Good Things would say, and they would argue that there's a considerable number of billions of economic benefit to be gained by giving people skills. When we talk about the workforce, other organisations like Future.now would point out that 60% of the youth, 69 to be exact, of the UK workforce lacks some of the core employment digital skills, the essential digital skills for employment the government has a list of, but 60% of the workforce lacks some of those essential digital skills. Therefore, their ability maybe to be productive employees in a digital context is limited.
Is there also an issue with the infrastructure in this country? Because as far as I'm aware, we have relatively slow broadband compared to our competitor countries, and our 5G speed is about the worst in the modern world. Is that holding the nation back?
And infrastructure is an interesting challenge. Yes, there are aspects of British infrastructure that lag behind other parts of the world, but in other parts of the world we're much further ahead. There are big infrastructure issues coming, and the copper wires for our telephone lines are all about to be turned off in the next couple of years. Everybody will then have to have either a broadband connection or a mobile phone if they want to be able to use telephone services, and this is going to impact everything from emergency buttons for older people in homes to traffic lights. There is a huge infrastructure change needed as that copper network turns off in the next couple of years. The usual argument is, of course, that rural areas don't have broadband or that they have poor mobile coverage, and that's what creates digital exclusion there. In truth, the broadband is getting a lot better to rural areas, though mobile is still a challenge. But we've actually found, to our surprise actually, in urban areas of kind of not spots in urban areas where tower block social housing, they haven't put the broadband in because essentially the people living there are unlikely to buy the higher end expensive services, and it's very expensive to get it into that tower block because of infrastructure issues, you know, especially post-Grenfell and things. You don't want to put lots of wires through a building without doing it carefully. And then there's loads of legal issues because you're covering lots of different land owned by different people to get this complex set of buildings, which suddenly then is not economically viable, and suddenly you've got a group of people the size of a small village disconnected in the middle of an urban area. So there are infrastructure issues. I mean, the government has put quite a bit of money into trying to drive the infrastructure, you know, solutions, and obviously that's the first step. If there's no wire to your house or no mobile connection, there's not much more you can do, unless you're very wealthy and buy Starlink or something. So yes, there are infrastructure issues. Whether they're much worse or better than other parts of the world is complex. That's the thing. I mean, the USA has areas that are fantastic and areas that are terrible.
Given what we've been talking about, was Jeremy Corbyn's idea of free broadband for all as crackpot an idea as his critics said it was?
Well, I do think there's an argument for considering kind of broadband infrastructure, communications infrastructure, alongside your new water and your gas and your electricity. You know, those core services, because if you're disconnected in our world, it has quite, you know, huge consequences. So if it were possible to consider lower VAT on broadband, has been proposed by some people, or, you know, to go further, everybody gets a basic level of broadband, you know, and then if you want faster and whatever on top, maybe that's where you pay more. I think there is a strong argument for really looking at how you make sure that everybody's got a minimum level of connection. There are social tariffs available so that people on certain benefits and in certain kind of circumstances can get a lower tariff. You know, they can get a package for 12 or 15 pounds rather than 20 something pounds a month. But unfortunately, we find that for some lower income families, that's still too much because you can't afford that and the mobile phone and so on. But yes, there needs to be some thought about how this has become an essential utility, something that's essential for everyday life rather than a nice to have, you know, which it may have been 20 years ago, but today it's an essential.
Simeon, very good to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time. Simeon Yates, Professor of Digital Culture at the University of Liverpool, Joint Director of the Digital Media and Society Institute, and lead researcher for the study. Now, if you missed any of tonight's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, which is the official LBC app. You can also pause and rewind live radio with it. If you haven't got it, it's free. Get it from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. I'll be back Friday, Saturday, Sunday night at 10. Coming up at 4, Ian Payne. But first, Richard Spur.
Good morning, Steve. Spencer speaks at length about the abuse he received at the hands of a matron when he was just 11. I'll be asking if boarding schools can ever be a force for good. But first, Vaughan Gething has become the first black leader of Wales, and indeed the first black political leader in any European...
Hello, I'm Eileen McHugh with the BBC News. Vladimir Putin has said his victory in Russia's presidential election shows the trust of the people in its current path. Mr. Putin said that when Russia was united, it could not be intimidated or suppressed. From Moscow, Steve Rosenberg reports.
Having been told he'd won 87% of the vote, it's no surprise that Vladimir Putin was sounding confident, defiant.
Кто бы никак не хотел нас запугать.
Addressing supporters, he said no matter how hard anyone tried to scare or suppress Russia's will or consciousness, he would never succeed. He felt confident enough to mention by name the man who'd been his fiercest critic the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny.
Что касается господина Навального, да, он ушел.
Mr. Putin never said Mr. Navalny's name before in public. The Kremlin leader claimed he'd agreed to a prisoner swap involving Mr. Navalny before the politician died in prison in an election controlled by the Kremlin. A landslide for Vladimir Putin is no surprise, but it is important for Putin. He can now claim he has a popular mandate for the war in Ukraine and for his transformation of Russia into an increasingly militaristic society.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said it was clear to the world that Mr. Putin must stop at nothing to rule forever. He said there was no evil the Russian president would not commit. His words were echoed by Poland and Britain, who noted that holding elections in occupied Ukraine was illegal. The White House has also commented on the election results, as Will Vernon reports from Washington.
We've had a very brief statement from the White House after the initial results, in inverted commas, were released. They said the elections are obviously not free nor fair, given how Mr. Putin has imprisoned political opponents and prevented others from running against him. And that really echoes what many people were telling me down at the Russian embassy here in Washington earlier. Several hundred people had gathered to cast their votes, but also many of them to hold a protest against Vladimir Putin.
The European Union and Egypt have signed an $8 billion agreement aimed at boosting cooperation in trade and security, as well as trying to stem the flow of migrants into Europe. The deal upgrades the EU's relationship with Egypt to a strategic partnership. Grants, loans and other funds are due to be delivered over the next 3 years to support Egypt's faltering economy. The financial crisis has prompted an increasing number of Egyptians to try to cross to Europe, mainly via Libya, since the authorities have largely closed down the route from Egypt's north coast. I'm Eileen McHugh and you're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. A BBC investigation has revealed that dozens of women from Malawi working as domestic servants in Oman have suffered abuse. They had travelled to the Gulf state after being promised good jobs by recruitment agents. Azizat Allahu has the details.
Women told Africa Eye that they were beaten, raped and treated like prisoners whilst working in the Gulf country. The Malawi government has paid over $160,000 to release and repatriate more than 50 female domestic workers. According to recent data, there have been no prosecutions of Omani nationals for treatment of domestic workers. Oman's Labour Ministry has told the BBC forced labour is illegal, and it has only received one complaint from a Malawian domestic worker in the 2 years to 2023.
Uber has agreed to pay $178 million to compensate thousands of taxi drivers in Australia who claimed they lost income when the rideshare company aggressively entered the local market. The lawyers who led the case say the payment will be the 5th largest class action settlement in Australian history. It comes 5 years after the action was launched on behalf of more than 8,000 taxi and hire car owners and drivers who alleged Uber disregarded existing regulations. A chartered flight carrying US citizens out of Haiti has arrived in Miami with about 24 people on board. It had flown out of the northern town of Cap Haitian as gang violence has closed the airport in the capital, Port-au-Prince. The embassy had warned that Americans would have to travel to Cap Haitian at low risk. A Mexican ballerina has led more than 5,000 people in a dance class in the main square in Mexico City. The event, believed to be the largest of its kind, was organized by the Mexican Ministry of Culture to allow people of all ages to discover the beauty of classical dance. BBC News.
Hello, this is Alex Ridson with the newsroom. The election in Russia may have been a sham as far as the West is concerned, but it proved that Mr. Putin has the ability to get himself declared re-elected as president on almost 90% of the votes cast, with no legitimate opposition challenging him. Nevertheless, Alexei Navalny, his fiercest critic who died in prison last month, still haunts him. On Sunday, Mr. Navalny's supporters were undaunted, visiting his grave in Moscow. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg has this report.
For Vladimir Putin, 6 more years in the Kremlin. Russia's president is sounding more confident than ever.
Кто бы никак не хотел нас запугать.
Whoever might want to intimidate us, whoever might want to suppress us, our will and our conscience, they have never been able to do it and never will.
Что касается господина Навального.
Then, Mr. Putin's first public comments on the death of jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny.
Я вам скажу, это будет так неожиданно.
You may be surprised, but a few days before Mr. Navalny died, some colleagues of mine told me there was an idea to exchange him for certain people in prison in the West. You can believe it or not. I said, I agree, even before he'd finished talking. So what happened, happened.
Мы сможем сообщить вам результаты.
Election results on Russian TV, not a hold your breath moment.
Кандидат президента Владимир Путин в...
The winner, by a mile and a half, Vladimir Putin.
Невероятная поддержка, невероятное единение.
What an incredible level of support and unity around the figure of Putin, he says, and a powerful signal to the West. But in this race, Vladimir Putin was, from the start, unbeatable. There were other candidates, but no serious challenger. Potential rivals here are swiftly removed from the political stage, forced into exile or put in jail. And elections tightly controlled by the Kremlin. But if they couldn't win, Mr. Putin's opponents could at least protest. And they did, in many parts of Russia. Opposition figures had called on Russians to flood polling stations at midday, to vote against Putin or spoil their ballots, a symbolic protest against the system. I've never seen queues like this before at a Russian polling station. Before his death in prison, Alexei Navalny had backed the protest. It took courage to come. The authorities had warned that large crowds at noon would be viewed as illegal gatherings.
I was here as
Ivan, not his real name, told me why he'd come.
it was important for me to see faces of other people who would come here today and to see that I'm not alone in my political views, and that there are a lot of Muscovites and other people who believe that Russia can be another country with another future.
For now, there'll be no change in the Kremlin. This election was never about would Vladimir Putin win or wouldn't he. Elections here are designed to ensure he wins, and wins big. From the outset, for the Kremlin, this vote was about creating the impression that Mr. Putin has a mandate from his people, not only for war in Ukraine, but also for what he's doing at home, transforming Russia into an increasingly militaristic society. But across town, Muscovites continued to pay tribute to Alexei Navalny, the man who'd wanted to be Russia's president. Here, a ballot paper, in place of Putin's name, Navalny's, and this message: he's the candidate we wanted. So, what can we expect from a fifth Putin term? I suspect more of the same. The direction of travel for Russia is pretty clear, and that means probably more repression at home and more confrontation with the West.
Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. At 71, President Putin is now on course to become the longest-serving Russian leader in more than 200 years. For more on Mr. Putin's victory address, I spoke to Francis Scarr from BBC Monitoring.
Well, I think it showed that he is very confident now. He is fully aware that he has cleared the Russian political stage of all potential opposition. Of course, those running against him in the election were not genuine opposition candidates. They were from the very pliant parliamentary opposition. He spoke a lot about the war in Ukraine and said that in particular voters in the occupied regions, or what Russia calls its new regions, parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk under Russian control, as well as Crimea, which has been occupied since 2014, of course. He said that they had showed that they were not intimidated by Ukraine and by the West, and that they had come out in higher numbers even than the national average, with over 90% of people reportedly voting for President Putin in those regions. Of course, the election, in particular in those regions, can hardly be called free or fair. What he did hit out at, though, was those who, over the past 3 days, have been pouring dye and ink into ballot boxes in locations across the country. A few cases of this have been recorded. He said that they were obstructing the democratic will of the people and that they would be punished in due course by the law. Election authorities have said that people found guilty of such acts could face up to 5 years in prison.
And some 80 people arrested.
That's true. Across the country, around 80 people have been arrested, according to an independent rights monitor. There were reports of people writing anti-war messages on their ballot papers being arrested, presumably demonstrating them publicly, because Russia, for all the faults of its electoral system, is still ostensibly a secret ballot. Other people have been arrested for arson attacks or for pouring ink into the ballot boxes. I think, though, that this is fairly low level in terms of what we've seen at protests, opposition protests in the past across Russia, and shows really now that the political situation is firmly under the control of President Vladimir Putin.
President Putin also mentioned Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who died, of course, in a Russian gulag a few weeks before the election. Mentioned him for the first time. What should we read into that by name?
Well, the fact that he decided to comment on Navalny, saying that his death was sad, but that other people had died in prison, with the extra aside that some people die in prison in the US as well, again betrays this extra confidence that President Putin now has following this election, that he is the only person that matters in Russia politically.
Yeah, he's now on course to overtake Joseph Stalin for his longevity in the Kremlin.
Indeed, if he completes his 5th term, by 2030 he will have overtaken Joseph Stalin, and there doesn't appear to be much other than his health stopping him from running for another term in 2030 until 2036, when he had the constitution changed back in 2020 with a referendum that was widely condemned as being neither free nor fair. He cleared the way for a further 12 years in power. He, of course, was meant to originally have to step down now, but that is not going to happen.
Francis Scar from BBC Monitoring. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has given a defiant response to criticism of Israel's military operation in Gaza. He's vowed to go ahead with a planned offensive in Rafah, where much of the Gazan population has fled to escape fighting elsewhere. Mr. Netanyahu said Israel would not leave Palestinian civilians trapped during the offensive.
Our goal in eliminating the remaining terrorist battalions in Rafah goes hand in hand with enabling the civilian population to leave Rafah. It's not something that we will do while keeping the population locked in place.
But at the same news conference, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz expressed concern over what he called the terribly high costs of Israel's war against Hamas. He called for more humanitarian aid and said an offensive in Rafah must be avoided at all costs.
It's important to bear in mind that there are now 1.5 million civilians, children, old people, many who are simply desperate, and for whose lives there's also a responsibility on the part of those who are taking military action here. Now, however, it's a question of reaching an agreement very quickly on a temporary ceasefire and securing the release of the hostages.
This assessment from our correspondent Mark Lowen in Jerusalem.
Well, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz is keeping the pressure up on Benjamin Netanyahu over more humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, but also over Israel's plans to send its military into Rafah in southern Gaza, where about 1.4 million Gazans are sheltering, more than half of the entire population of the Gaza Strip. Israel seems determined to push into Rafah. The Prime Minister saying earlier in the day that Israel is determined to push on to total victory, as he says it, which means an operation in Rafah to crush Hamas and get the Israeli hostages back. But that has met with international criticism, not least from the US. President Biden said a week ago that that would cross a red line as far as his administration is concerned. And a couple of days ago, the Senate Majority Leader in the US, in effect, called for Benjamin Netanyahu's replacement, calling him an obstacle to peace. But, you know, in vintage Netanyahu style, he is pushing back, he's digging in, he's facing more criticism both at home and abroad, but he is sounding defiant, saying Israel will push on, it will achieve these twin aims of destroying Hamas and getting the hostages back, and he lambasted his international critics for, in his words, losing their moral conscience and forgetting about the Hamas attack of the 7th of October. The question is, if the Israeli military does go into Rafah, what would they do with those sheltering there? They would have to find a safe place for them to be, they would have to provide them with food and water, it would take time, it would take manpower. At the moment, the US says they've not received a detailed plan from Israel over the operation in Rafah. So there are still big questions over the logistics and timing of that operation, if indeed it does happen at all.
Mark Lowen in Jerusalem. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Our main news: President Putin has said his overwhelming election victory demonstrates the Russian people's trust in him. He's vowed to continue his war in Ukraine and, for the first time in years, has mentioned the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny by name. Miami Airport has welcomed the first US chartered flight out of Haiti in weeks. The plane evacuating a few dozen American citizens departed from Cap Haitian, a port city almost 200 kilometers away from the gang violence gripping the capital, Port-au-Prince. The UN estimates more than 360,000 people are internally displaced, adding to an already complex political and security crisis. Our Central America correspondent, Will Grant, is in Cap Haitian. I asked him why so few people were on board.
In all honesty, those who already wanted to get out from this particular part of Haiti where I am, on the northern coastal city of Cap Haitian, probably had other opportunities to do so over the past couple of weeks since the airports have been closed. Specifically, they could have taken either public transport to an extent, but certainly a private transport to the border with the Dominican Republic and just walked over the border there. Others might have been simply waiting to see if the international flights started up again from Cap Haitian, perhaps to one of the other Caribbean islands. There's been some evidence that they're beginning to start. And others simply consider it sufficiently safe and far enough from the violence in Port-au-Prince to stay put and are riding it out. It does speak to the fact that this is not a monolithic situation in Haiti, and that the violence seen in Port-au-Prince isn't uniform across the country. Cap Haitian is much calmer and has been the safe haven, a place of refuge for those fleeing that violence.
Are there any signs of the security or the humanitarian crisis improving?
Very little on either front. We'll start with the security side. No real indications of any advances there, and one has to wonder what would be considered an advance anyway. Is an advance successes by the police force in terms of striking back against the gangs or taking out some key gang bosses, or is it some kind of truce or ceasefire declared by the gangs themselves, given just how powerful they are, and that the fact that they control so much of the capital city, believed to be more than 80%. And on the humanitarian side, unfortunately, aid remains coming in at an absolute agonizingly slow pace, and it really is just coming in a trickle as far as we've heard, which is no way near sufficient for the scale of this crisis. I think people in Haiti who are in need of this aid, and we know that there is serious danger of starvation and extreme hunger in the capital, are desperate for that aid to come in, and very upset and confused as to why there hasn't been better coordinated and more comprehensive international response.
Will Grant in Haiti. The government inquiry in Australia has warned that invasive fire ants are a growing risk to both people and livestock. Discovered in Brisbane just 2 decades ago, they're now thought to pose a bigger threat than wild dogs, feral cats, camels, cane toads and foxes combined. Phil Mercer is in Sydney and joins us on the line. Phil, why are people so worried about fire ants?
Well, you speak to experts in this country, Alex, and they say that fire ants are one of the world's worst invasive species, and they warn that they are on the march across Australia. Health experts have told this parliamentary inquiry that was set up by lawmakers in October of last year that thousands of Australians could develop severe allergic reactions if these ants become endemic in this country. They are animals or creatures that invariably attack en masse. They swarm, inflict multiple stings, their jaws lock onto a victim's skin, they arch their bodies and inject venom through a stinger or a spike on their abdomen. And the authorities in Canberra investigating the health, social and economic consequences of these fire ants.
And, well, can they be got rid of?
They were first detected in the Queensland city of Brisbane back in 2001, but it's most likely that they were here undetected for up to 20 years, probably hitching a ride in a shipping container that have spread across Queensland's southern border into parts of New South Wales. They have been found at major ports, so all around Australia apart from Tasmania. And scientists say that Australia's climate and a lack of natural predators makes the island continent of Australia a perfect home for these fiery insects.
Because they're, as you say, all over the world. They're a big problem in the United States too, and efforts to eradicate them or control their numbers have, not amounted to much so far.
Well, millions of people are stung each year in the United States. These are creatures that are on the march, not just in the US, but also here in Australia, other parts of the world, including China. Now, the success and progress of Australia's efforts to contain and eradicate fire ants are coming under great scrutiny. The Queensland state government, for example, says that its response to the fire ant invasion has been world-class, but critics say that mismanagement and incompetence has allowed the fire ants to spread, and they say that this is an absolute tragedy, and the fire ants, they believe, spreading out of control.